Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 91 of Humanity Rising. Virtually every day since the 22nd of May, Ubiquity University and upwards of 400 partners from all over the world have created a sacred space, an open space, every day between 5 o'clock and 6:30 p.m. Central European Time, so that all of us can come together and share our experiences of what it's like going through this extraordinary pandemic that has put us all in some form of lockdown, social distancing, wearing masks, heightened awareness about our hygiene. How many times have you washed your hands today? And we're all going through this extraordinary experience together, because this is the first time literally in human history where virtually everyone everywhere is undergoing the same experience, and therefore we're all in the same conversation. And I want to just start by just noting something that we were talking about in the green room with the panelists before we started the session as we were getting ready. And that is the thing that has really been the most impressive to me as a person who's been every single session is simply the amount of human goodness there is. You know, we're watching the news and we're seeing division, we're seeing fear, we're seeing intolerance, we're seeing racism, we're seeing turbulence. We don't know what the future holds. But I have to tell you, the quality of simple human goodness that comes day in and day out through Humanity Rising just fills my heart, my soul with joy and with appreciation that I'm alive at this extraordinary time. And I don't know how we're going to make it through. I really don't. But I do know that we were all born for this moment. We were all born for a reason, and that reason is now. And whatever's happening on the evening news, I believe at the core of my being that if we sustain our commitment day by day, choice by choice, to bring goodness into the world, that somehow in some mysterious way, the spirit that guides the affairs of all of humankind on this precious planet will find a way. So I just wanted to say that to everyone as we begin this session, which will be really delving into how we can be generating a new story for ourselves. Evolution has been based on the notion of the survival of the fittest in a meaningless, materialist, mechanical world. And what's emerging, latest researches of the scientific frontier, is that's not what's happening at all. The earth is alive. And all the faculties that we have, from intelligence to emotions, to imagination, to compassion, we have because the earth has it. We are earth. The earth created us for a reason. And probably the most important thing we can do at this critical juncture is just tell ourselves this new story of a universe collaborating together, sentient beings cooperating together. That is the story that will bind as one, enable us to bring all the diversity that up to this point has divided us so relentlessly and cruelly through the dysfunction of racism into a harmony where all the colors of the rainbows that spread across the sky. are merged into a single commitment to create a world that is more abundant, more resilient, more healthy, more sustainable, and more in alignment with natural systems. So thank you, everyone. I now turn over the program to my dear friend and co-moderator, Sabinije von Gaffke, who will commence the program. Sabinije.
Thank you so much, Jim. And I truly echo your words. And that's also why it is both such an honor and pleasure to be part of Humanity Rising, because I really do see both the purpose and the potential of this platform to be this catalyst for change. And both with this live streaming of conscious dialogue, sparking inspired action, and creating this collective ecosystem for voices and leaders of change. And it's also this summit with a wealth of knowledge, wisdom, insight, innovation, and inspiration that each and every speaker and individual brings to the conversations here truly has the potential to transform life and our planet and create that new narrative, or at least navigate us on how to create that new narrative that is so needed and that you also touched upon. And we truly are living, of course, in turbulent times, but also in times where both inner and outer transformations, coexist. And this transformation really needs to happen quicker now. And it's based on a collective rising of consciousness, of course, systemic change and all the dialogues that we have here. But it really is about navigating us to really creating that future that is conscious, compassionate, sustainable. And like you also said, and that is, a red thread through everything, and that is collaborative. The future is leadership that involves conscious, heart-centered co-creators to pave the way. And that is also why today's session is also so important to have, looking at conscious evolution from contemplation to action, because it truly also is that we need the source of action to really take all this inspiration and make it into something doable. And this panel is going to explore the solutions that are emerging to help humanity transition from what we have more self-interest to this really collective unity and interest. Hopefully they'll also be exploring practices that can help break the crystallizations that are associated with this old story that we're referring to, and discuss how the integration of science and spirituality, because they really are, dancing in a tango, and also this inner and outer life combined are all the ingredients towards this collaborative and coherent future that we really, really must head towards. And just like Jim said, we were all born for these times, and it really is time for us to also feel the engagement of stepping up in unity and not in separateness. And that, of course, requires resilience, courage, compassion, a sense of meaning, and so much more, which I hope this platform really can be a convener of. And today's session is going to be with 4 really knowledgeable and wisdom-filled female leaders who really do have hands-on solutions about what we're talking about. And it's going to be thrilling to see what this session will conclude. And it's going to be moderated or convened by Jeff Genung, and I'd like to give him a short introduction. He's the co-founder of Contemplative Life, which is a nonprofit organization that connects people and communities with transformative practices. And he's also the co-founder of Transformation 365, which is an experiential practice network. So with that, I say a warm welcome to all of you in the audience. Thank you for joining us. Please send in your questions, because they're as relevant as any other, and I'm sure the panel will catch them. And I say a warm welcome to Jeff and the panelists.
Thank you, Sabine and Jim, for that very eloquent and accurate introduction to the session. And really, deep bows of gratitude to everybody at Ubiverse, Ubiquity University, the Humanity Rising Summit team for this work that you're doing. It's so important. And 91 days to take it from an inspiration, that Jim and Peter had to what it is now, to allow this collective wisdom that's emerging all over the world to begin to surface and to begin to kind of cross-fertilize. It's amazing, and really want to thank you. I'm very excited to introduce today's panel, an inspirational group of women that I've come to know and learn from, starting with Dr. Riane Eisler, who kind of doesn't need an introduction, but I'll introduce her anyways. She's the president of the Center for Partnership Studies, an internationally known author of The Chalice and the Blade, which is now in 27 foreign editions. Other books include The Real Wealth of Nation, and her recent book is titled Nurturing Our Humanity: How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Futures. This is a very important book. It's one that I'm finishing now, and it brings together all of our other work, but it also brings together research and the latest findings on social, biological, and neuroscience. How are we wired? Why is this happening? So it offers many jewels of wisdom, and she even coins a new word, partnerism. So we'll talk about that. Valeria Vergani is a religious scholar who's going to be on her way to Stanford to do her PhD studies in religious studies. She has helped convene and organize the Planetary Resilience Council, City and Focus Foundation, and is a global trustee for the United Religions Initiative. Diane Burke is the founder of the One Spirit Learning Alliance, which is the oldest and largest interspiritual seminary in the world. She's also a founding member of the Contemplative Alliance and a co-founder of Transformation 365, an experiential practice network. And Kate Sheehan Roach is vice president and co-founder of Contemplative Life. She's also a co-founder of Transformation 365 and a board member of URI. So, I want to just kind of set the stage a little bit here for this conversation. It seems like humanity is on a threshold of a new era, but there's still this question yet, are we ready collectively for sustainable, lasting change? And the reason I ask that is that I can remember, back in 9/11, and when, the United States was in a state of shock, in the sense it was afterwards is that, well, the world is different. Things we can't just return to, things as usual. But it snapped back. And then, I think back to the 2008 financial meltdown, which gave rise to the Occupy movement. But it didn't have the organizing principle to keep the structure and the momentum going, which often happens. And then we've seen, the Arab Spring and the amazing coming together for incredibly rapid and radical change, but it snapped back as well. So now we're in the midst of a global pandemic with numerous social movements like Black Lives Matter and other things that are calling for systemic change. However, both individually and collectively, with deep, deep honesty, we have to ask ourselves, how is this going to be different? For social change to occur at scale requires a common aim. It requires widespread cooperation, but it also requires organizing principles to help guide and govern and sustain such change. So our panel today will explore solutions that are emerging to help us transition from self-interest to collective interests. We'll explore the emergence of this new story for humanity that's beginning to bubble up all over the world. It's still in formation, but you can see it's happening. And then discuss how the integration of science and spirituality, the inner contemplative life, and our actions in the outer world can combine together to serve as a catalyst for this new vision. But to begin, I'd like to do something bold and invite us into 3 minutes of silence to kind of help clear the cares of the day and prepare us for this engaging conversation. Consider it a word from our sponsor. And feel free to have your eyes open or closed. Take some big, deep breaths. I have a bell here, and that'll tell us when to begin and when it's done. Thank you. So I'll begin, panelists, you're welcome to unmute. I'll begin by asking you each a question, just to kind of prime the pump here. And I'll begin with you, Riane. In your work, you refer to the four cornerstones for building a caring democracy. Can you tell us about these four cornerstones and the importance of these as a solution and the role that partnerism plays in this process.
Well, thank you so much, Jeffrey. I think that you were quite sobering in telling us that this isn't going to happen by itself. It's going to really require not only changes in consciousness, but beyond that, action. And my work, my research over many decades now has identified not only four cornerstones that we must build, but also, as Einstein said, we cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. A new way of thinking of this shift that we so urgently need, a shift from what I've called a domination system to a partnership system. And no, it does not just mean working together. It is a configuration, as you'll see from the Four Cornerstones. And if we go back really to modern history, we see that the progressive social movements have all challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination. Whether it was the so-called Enlightenment rights of man movement challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule, whether it was the feminist and later women's liberation, women's rights movement challenging another so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over the women and children in the so-called castles, military metaphor of their homes, whether it was the abolitionist or the later civil rights, and now, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, challenging another supposedly divinely ordained tradition of domination, the so-called right of a, quote, superior race to rule over inferior ones, all the way to the environmental movement, challenging our once hallowed conquest of nature that at our level of technological development, as we see all around us with climate change and other ways that we're completely destroying our natural life support systems, could do us in. But if you look at these movements, you see something very interesting, that most of the energy, resources, action has gone into dismantling what I've called the top of the domination pyramid, politics and economics as conventionally defined. But much less energy has gone into changing the foundations from domination to partnership of these four cornerstones, which I'll very briefly describe. The first is childhood. Now you may say childhood, because that's not really part of the conventional discourse, is it? But the truth of the matter, as is documented at length in my new book, Nurturing Our Humanity, how domination and partnership shape our brains, lives, and future. Neuroscience shows that, and this should be really part of common discussion, that what children first experience and observe is critical to the architecture of our brains, to how our brains develop, and hence how we feel, how we act, how we think, and including actions like how we vote. As you mentioned in these, like the Arab Spring, because there is this very domination-oriented family, what happened is that they voted for a leadership that was essentially another version of the domination system, a rigid fundamentalist, so-called religious fundamentalist regime, which I call domination, or, really fundamentalism. So we know today that the old, quote, traditional ways of raising children with fear, with force, where caring is conflated with coercion, is fundamental to accepting strongman rule in not only the family, but in the state or tribe. The second is gender. And again, you may say, what does gender have to do with anything of, with cultural transformation? Because that's what we're talking about. And the answer is everything. Because what we have in domination families, and children internalize this very early before their brains, much less their critical faculties, are developed, is a model of our species in which one form of humanity, the male form, as it turns out, is considered superior to another basic form, which is the female form. And then children grow up with a template for equating difference, be it based on gender, on sex, be it based on race, be it based on religion, be it based on sexual orientation, and it doesn't have to be like racism in the United States. It can be Shia versus Sunni, for example. In the Middle East, it doesn't matter. It's in-group versus out-group, with the sense of entitlement of the in-group and the sense internalized by everybody, women and men. This has nothing to do with anything of women against men or men against women, internalizes. So we have inherited a gendered system of valuations, which takes me to the third cornerstone, economics. But economics that goes beyond both capitalism and socialism, because both not only came out of very early, the 1700s and the 1800s, very early industrial times, and we're now in the post-industrial knowledge service economy, but they came out of more rigid domination-oriented times, not only in families, but in the kings and nobles and, the whole quote nobles, and, because they why they're called nobles when their favorite sport was to go to the castle next door and kill everybody, and is another issue. It's an issue of the fourth cornerstone, which is story. But we have inherited a gendered system of valuations passed on by both capitalism and socialism that basically considers the most fundamental human work, the work that we all need to survive, the work of caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems, just reproductive rather than productive work. So there's always money, right? You've noticed, because we've inherited this system. For prisons, what is that? That is the stereotype of the punitive male head of household, right? Or there's always enough money for weapons and wars. The hero is killer, but somehow there isn't enough money for the soft, for the so-called feminine, caring for children, health care, child care, paid family leave, all the things that we can see we so need today, because the COVID pandemic has really revealed how false the uncaring values governing present economic systems are. Okay, and that is the difference, by the way. And it's a fundamental difference between what happened in the earlier times when things were shaken up and what's happening today, which takes me finally to the last one. And this is, they're all interconnected, and we all need to understand they're part of the partnerism movement, not right versus left, or religious versus secular, or Eastern versus Western, or Northern versus Southern. Because if you think about it, there have been oppressive, repressive, violent regimes in every one of these categories, and every one of these categories, and this is fundamental, pays little attention, either marginalizes or ignores the majority of humanity, women and children. I mean, think about that for a moment. because we're not used to thinking that way. So we have developed, and maybe we can talk about that later, some new metrics, social wealth, economic indicators that show the economic value, the return on investment from investing in caring for people starting at birth and caring for our Mother Earth. And that takes me to story and to language. We've been told a false story about human nature, as Jim Garrison alluded to, and there is a lot of evidence in nurturing our humanity from neuroscience. And we've long known this, of course, from psychology, that human nature has been absolutely misrepresented. But think about it, whether it's original sin or selfish genes, it's the same story. We're bad, we have to be rigidly controlled from the top. And language, linguistic psychologists tell us that the categories, and this is especially true of social categories, provided by our languages, actually channel our thinking. So it's almost impossible to really think that there are other alternatives. And this work really provides a path, a road to build solid foundations so that change can be sustainable, so that domination systems don't keep rebuilding themselves on these same four cornerstones, whether it was totalitarianism, whether it's fundamentalism, whether it's what's happening in much of the West today. It's really these foundations. And I want to leave you with a thought. Why do you think that whether it was for Hitler in Germany, for Stalin in the former Soviet Union, for Khomeini in Iran, for the Taliban, for ISIS, it's always a top priority to either maintain or return to a mislabeled, by the way, quote, because there were earlier times when we didn't, for millennia, we didn't live this way, a family that they like to call a traditional family. And as I said, that's wrong, because the traditional family was very different. It was more of a partnership family. And what is that family? It is authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, and highly punitive. So I leave you with that to think about, because if we don't build the foundations, you wouldn't think of building a house without solid foundations. We must put energy into the partnerism movement. And this is not just Western, because I see a comment that this is a Western disease. I wish that it were true, but if you think of genital mutilation, if you think of all the trauma that's built into, if you think of the Chinese Empire or China today, these are domination systems, for goodness sakes. And yes, in bits and pieces, some indigenous societies have maintained their partnership character, which is discussed at length, by the way, by my co-author, the anthropologist Douglas Fry, who is probably the world's authority on foraging societies, how we lived for millennia. But I really don't want to take any more time. And I just want to close by saying we can do it, but to do it, we have to really focus attention, not just on what's happening today, not only on protesting, on deconstruction, but on reconstruction, with special attention to these four cornerstones.
My first response is, wow. Sagely insight, Riane, and so important, because what you're talking about, very appropriately termed cornerstones, this is the substratum, and it's the hard stuff. You can, work on the edges, which is where a lot of work is being done, is the stuff above that. But if we don't get to the root and address this, then it's just going to be recycled. It's going to be recurring. Thank you so much. And it's never easy to follow Riane, but Diane, I got a question for you. You know, you founded One Spirit Learning Alliance in New York City. And I want to ask you, what inspired you to start One Spirit? And can you define or speak a little bit about, you know, this word that Wayne Teasdale coined, interspirituality?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. What inspired me to start One Spirit in some ways was actually the experience of 9/11. I had been involved in interfaith work already for about 15 years, and in the training of interfaith ministers and spiritual counselors who were seeking to look beyond simply understanding and developing tolerance for other religions, different religions, to looking to and emphasizing the universal values, the universal humanity that would be lifted up in each of the religions. After 9/11, the urgency of that work became crystal clear to me. And around the same time, I read Wayne Teasdale's book, The Mystic Heart, in which he coined the term interspirituality. And I suddenly recognized in that language the real essence of the work we had been doing. So I wanted to start a learning institution that would focus on what I saw as the evolution beyond the interfaith, interreligious dialogue, which had been, again, focused more at the level of understanding one another's belief systems, one another's origin stories, one another's observances, and having respect for those differences, to interspirituality, which focuses more on the deeper experience of unity and oneness that all of the great religions began as a revelation of, and that could bring us together at that deeper meeting place of experiencing not only our shared humanity and interrelationship and interdependence, but our identification with the entirety of creation, the entirety of being, the entirety not only of the human family, but the family of all living beings and the family of the cosmos. So that was really the inspiration for beginning One Spirit, to have a platform in which that could be the primary focus and thrust of the work we did. As I said, interspirituality really is an evolution from the work of interfaith and interreligious dialogue that emerged after World War II, as everyone began to realize that we needed to find ways of being able to talk to each other and resolve conflict and resolve difficulties if there was even to be a future. Initially, again, those conversations focused primarily at the level of the intellect, at the level of understanding what people in different religions believed, the creation stories, the cosmic stories that and narratives that live at the heart of the theology of the various religions. And certainly given the amount of division, the amount of strong attachment to, as Riane said, fundamentalist perspectives within each of the religions, that kind of dialogue is still extraordinarily valuable and necessary and important in the world. But what began to happen historically is that out of these conversations, actual relationships began to form among people of different religious backgrounds and religious identification. And there began to be some sharing of experience, some sharing of observances, some sharing of the experience of worship, visiting. When I was growing up, people from some of the local churches would come visit the synagogue for a Friday night Sabbath service. Kids from the Sunday school would be taken to a Methodist church on a Sunday morning to have an experience of what that was like. And at the same time, people began to work together on projects for their local communities, for issues of justice and equality. And those relationships began a kind of deepening process and the possibility of going beyond simply this level of intellectual understanding to the possibility, in Riane's beautiful language, the possibility of partnering in service to shared and common goals and interests. That began the emergence of something that has been called trans-traditional spirituality, where there's the beginning of experiential sharing as well as intellectual dialogue and understanding. Out of that, and particularly among the most mature practitioners in the various religious and spiritual traditions, as trust developed, as relationships deepened over time and trust developed, there began to be an even deeper level of sharing of practices and of the experience that contemplative practice makes available to us. And through gatherings like Father Thomas Keating's Snow Mass, originally he called them interreligious gatherings, but then began to call them interspiritual gatherings. People began to recognize that that their experiences, regardless of how different their theologies might be, regardless of how different the language and concepts through which they expressed and described their experience of this deeper ground of meeting, this deeper ground of interdependence, interrelationship, unity, that there was something they could recognize in each other's experience, something that lived at the level of the heart, that lived at the level of the soul, not at the level of the intellect. And they began sharing together some of the contemplative practices that were part of their traditions that helped them tap into this deeper level of joining. And that kind of sharing is what Wayne Teasdale was referring to as interspirituality. And he said that the evolution of religion and the evolution of spirituality would emerge from ordinary people engaging in extraordinary relationships. And that very much seems to describe how this has come about. he describes interspirituality without, it's not an attempt to homogenize religion. It's not an attempt to erase the incredible diversity and richness and gifts of that each of the religions bring to this incredible diamond of human wisdom and human compassion. But it recognizes that mystical experience of unity, which is the heart of spirituality, that spirituality is meant to take us through a transformative process that moves the center of gravity of our identification from separateness, from the ego, from the self-protected, separate self, to a broader sense of identification. So from a me orientation to a we orientation. But then even beyond that, because that we orientation initially focuses on my group. So it goes from just me to my little group, which again is where so much of the division, so much of, as Riane was saying, in-group versus out-group, all of that happens at that level of worldview that says, I'm identified primarily with my group, to an expansion that deeper experience of unity makes possible, to from me to we to all of us, where the sense of primary identification is with humanity as a whole. And then even beyond that, from me to we to all of us to all of life, where our identification becomes with the whole of the living creation. So the path of interspirituality is really designed to support people in moving through that developmental trajectory, and to recognize that within religions themselves, you can find expressions at each of those developmental levels, and that religion has as a possibility to support its own adherence in moving along that path of maturation.
I'd have to say that's probably the most condensed and accurate description of interspirituality that I've ever heard, apart from Wayne's own words in The Mystic Heart. Thank you for that. And it's a perfect introduction to the question I have for you, Valeria. We served together on a panel at the World Parliament of World Religions, and I was really moved by your wisdom and insight, and have learned about your focus, which is on interfaith and interreligious collaboration. And I know you serve on the board for the United Religions Initiative. And so I wondered if you could say a few words about the United Religions Initiative and what you're seeing in terms of interreligious and interspiritual cooperation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you everybody for being here today. I'm so humbled and so blessed to be on this panel with Riane and Diane and Kate, and to share a bit of what URI does. And I think the URI story very, very much resonates with what both of you, Riane and Diane, already have shared. And with this movement, this evolution from interfaith and interreligious dialogue at something that's really brainy, something that's in the head, to something that is of the heart and of the soul. And the story of URI, the United Religions Initiative, really also, Jeff, is a story that starts with the failure of our traditional or collective systems based in domination, and wanting to move towards a partnership that starts from the grassroots. And therefore, by starting from the grassroots, starting from place, starting from communities that are on the land, in place, really has to put women, children, indigenous people at the center of what URI does. So URI is now in its 20th year. So it became ratified, and the charter of URI became ratified in 2000, so 20 years ago. And it started as the idea of an Episcopalian bishop in California, Bishop William Swing of San Francisco, who in the late 90s was watching the 50th anniversary of the UN and thought, well, what about religions? If we are at a moment in our collective history where the nations are starting to come together and talk to each other, what about the religions? And he went and tried to talk to religious leaders around the world to get them to say, can you please deputize somebody that will represent you, and we will have a united religions? And he said, well, that was a story of failure, because the religious leaders that he went to said, no, we're not interested in that. We have our own little in-group that we are looking after. We have our own interests. We have our own identity. And we're not so willing to spend time, money, and resources to send out to the broader whole of the religious and spiritual communities around the world. And so Bishop Singh said, okay, well, if the leaders are not going to do it, then we have to go to the grassroots. We have to tap into the local communities that are carrying out that very fundamental, important interspiritual work of coming together across differences through transformative practice, and then leading that into the action of caring for community, starting from what's small, starting from what's local, and then uniting across nations, across the globe, across regions, to talk to one another, to share stories, to share capacity building strategies, to share resources in all sorts of ways, to share wisdom with one another. And so the way that URI works as a result of this effort is that URI is based on a collective membership model. And so this helps us already start to think about some of the solutions we're going to talk about in the panel. A collective membership model that is based in what we call the cooperation circle. And so myself and Kate and Jeff, as members of URI cooperation circles, they are members of small groups that come together across religious traditions, across cultural traditions. Every cooperation circle must have at least 7 members from at least 3 different spiritual, indigenous, or religious traditions coming together for a common and shared purpose that is about not looking at the in-group, not about reinforcing a group identity over and above that of others, but that is really about coming together for the benefit of all. And then those cooperation circles join together with other cooperation circles to have a regional network. For example, the North American network includes cooperation circles in Canada and the US, and there's over 100 of those in this region. And then those join together with cooperation circles across regions worldwide. And URI, as of now, has over 1,000 cooperation circles in over 100 countries. And that means that people from the grassroots are coming together everywhere for these common purposes, and then being able to talk to one another with people that are in other parts of the world, to share their wisdom, to share their capacities, to come together, and to especially break down a sense of isolation, a sense of separateness. Oftentimes, I think we all know that when we really get into the depths of our work, we can get depleted, or we can feel that things are not going the way that we wish them to. And so having a network of groups all over the world that can talk to each other and can show one another what we're doing, how our success stories, how we're building hope, how we're really moving to this new human story, is a way in which we can really replenish ourselves and come back to the fullness and the abundance that we have and that we can share with one another. So in some ways, URI is an outlier in the interfaith movement, because, as Diana so eloquently shared, the interfaith movement has been built primarily upon a respect of difference and a respect of the ways in which our theologies or dogmas are different across religious traditions. But URI, I think, is part of interfaith communities that are making an effort to hold a creative balance and a creative tension between our diversities, our differences, and our commonalities, our unity, our experience of oneness, and to be able to walk that tension creatively and spiritually, to be able to build communities across the world that are working for the same purpose. So that is a URI story, and it's unfolding. And I'm so pleased to say that I, as a younger person, have come into a community that was already flourishing because of the amazing work of people like you all that have done to pave the path for what we have now. And I'm looking forward to hearing about more solutions.
Thank you. It always comes down to the grassroots, because change isn't something that comes from without. It begins from within, and then it begins to grow from there. Next, I want to invite you, Kate, to talk about a very exciting new initiative that you're leading the development of, which is the integration of evolutionary science and evolutionary spirituality. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about prosocial spirituality and the promise that it offers.
I'd be happy to, Jeff. Thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I am so honored to be among such wonderful, wise women in this extraordinary, excruciating, yet exquisite time that we live. I'm struck by so much of what's been shared already. I'm almost dumbstruck, really, where the silence is really holds the vastness of what we're talking about here. So thank you for starting us with silence, Jeff, and for your place as a wisdom keeper in bringing together this panel. I'm thinking of Margaret Mead saying, never doubt the ability of a small group of thoughtful, committed people to change the world. Indeed, that's the only thing that ever has. So as we sit together as a small group of people, talking about other small groups of people, whether it's at URI or at One Spirit or in the partnership model, we're seeing that this is happening, and it's giving me great heart. It's cheering my weary heart, where I have college students living with me. My own children have to do college under my own roof. With my husband and I we're a first year and a fourth year in college all over again with our kids, and I recognize the weight on their shoulders, tremendous weight of these things we talk about, weigh very heavily on them. And so I thank you and thank all of you out listening for doing the hard work, the heavy lifting, and not passing it on to the next generation. So that's what prosocial spirituality is about. It has emerged at a time where small groups are changing the world, but small groups need a new model. We need a new infrastructure. The old one is crumbling under our feet. I mean, it's crumbling in visible ways. That the patriarchy is. I recently saw an amazing podcast coming out about the death throes of the patriarchy, and the image was of a dinosaur with its tail flailing. And yes, that tail is flailing, and it's knocking us aside. But we get up and we move forward again, and we sit in solidarity with one another in the silence. So that's really how prosocial spirituality has emerged. It's a partnership, to speak to Riane's amazing vision. It is a partnership between contemplative life and Prosocial.World, where we can say honestly that science and spirituality are coming together as one. Prosocial.World is built upon the wisdom of a political scientist, really. Elinor Ostrom was a political scientist who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in understanding that the tragedy of the commons didn't have the last word, that actually if people have certain elements in place, they can work together and use resources wisely. So for this, she was granted the Nobel Prize, and she later came on to work with David Sloan Wilson, who is one of the real incubators of this prosocial idea that we can come together and not tear one another apart and not deplete the earth when these elements that Elinor Ostrom discovered through field work. She didn't invent them. She didn't come up with them and pass them on. She spent much research in the field discovering these 8 core design principles that when they are present in groups will thrive. And I could go on and on about that, but that's one arm of prosocial spirituality. That's the prosocial arm. The spirituality arm is really what we're bringing in to augment this, is based on the 9 elements of a universal spirituality, which came out of, I think everybody's made a little mention to either Brother Wayne Teasdale or Father Thomas Keating, who in this Snowmass dialogue came away with some universal points of agreement between the world's religions. Brother Wayne took that one step further into sort of ways of being, things to cultivate, these 9 elements of universal spirituality, things like, cultivating the moral capacity, humility, spiritual practice. There are 9 of them. I won't describe them all. These 8 and these 9 are the framework. They're the infrastructure of prosocial spirituality, that through trainings, experiential trainings, we are cultivating a new framework among groups. So these groups can be anything from, corporate boards to grassroots social justice movements to spiritual groups to, it really applies even in the family context, or maybe especially in the family context. But by engaging in these trainings with these 2 sets of principles guiding us, what we're finding is something truly new comes through the center. There's a third stream here that, if we are diligent, like Margaret Mead described, thoughtful and committed to these principles that Elinor Ostrom discovered in global field work, and what Father Thomas Keating and Brother Wayne Teasdale really just codified, something that's, again, it was already out there. These are human discoveries that by incorporating them in these trainings, we can actually help groups thrive in the ways we're meant to thrive, and create a new framework for this amazing work. This is the solution work, that we actually do need this. And I'll close with just a little image that I keep in mind for myself. You've probably heard it before. It's kind of silly, but it's an image of 2 young fish swimming through the ocean, just having a good old time. And an elder fish comes along and yells, "Hey fellas, hey kids, how's the water?" And these young fish are just swimming along, and they just see the elder fish, "Hey, whatever, old guy," keep swimming. And as they get around the coral reef, they look to one another and say, "What the heck is water?" And it reminds me that we're swimming in the old way. We're swimming in, we've all been birthed into a way, as Riane talked about, capitalism, socialism, I mentioned the patriarchy, that none of us rises above that. We're swimming in it. But if we want change, I think we have to, I will just speak for myself, I have to acknowledge my part and not think that I am somehow so woke that I'm beyond needing the change myself. So recognizing that I need to work together with these amazing minds and hearts and souls that I'm blessed to be with today, and really commit in a thoughtful way to this new way, and to be willing to invest in training myself the same way, Gandhi and Martin Luther King trained in nonviolence. They had to train one another before they could change the world. And that's really what we're doing at Prosocial Spirituality.
Thank you very much. Listening to this kind of collective wisdom that's being shared, which are solution-based. This is what's exciting about it. It's not just identifying the issues that we need to solve, but here are some practical and teachable, trainable things that we can do to actually create the change. And so I think part of the next phase is that how do we weave these together? And this is what's different. I mean, there's always been good people in good organizations doing good things. But one of the things that's different that we're seeing now is that they're finding each other. The Humanity Rising Summit, things like this is bringing them together. And so it's like these individual strands that are have their own strength. When you begin to weave these strands together, they become a cord, and it becomes very, very strong. So part of the discussion that I like to have, and really kind of turn it over to each of you to ask each other, is how do we cooperate together? How do we bring these strands together in a cooperative way so that the individual solutions and the individual work that's being done can be energized and begin to move in an exponential way? Just one other thing too, is that it kind of occurs to me too, when I think about interspirituality, which is evolutionary, ecumenism, interfaith, interreligious, interspiritual. So you can see there's a progression going on. When we look at, Elinor Ostrom's work with the 8 core design principles, which she won the Nobel Prize for, which I see as kind of the structure. But Riane, your work I see is the foundation. And each of these things, the inner life practice, contemplative experience, the structure of how groups flourish together, the Elinor Ostrom's work, yours is kind of the bedrock of how do we address this story? We're getting fed the wrong story together. How do we begin to weave these together? And so that's what I'll turn over, and with open ears and heart and mind, would love to hear what you have to say. You can ask each other. So you're the moderators now.
Well, I will ask the wonderful group of panelists. We've launched what we call Make Partnerism Mainstream. There's a website which is partnerism.org. And I would like to ask you how and if, because what I think, how can you incorporate this into what you're doing? Because everything you're doing is part of the movement towards partnerism. But we have lacked, as Jeff said, the common container. And so we're all of these wonderful, but fragmented, really, social and spiritual movements. I mean, when I think of spirituality, I think of putting love into action. Because we can meditate, and that's very, very important. But if we do nothing, once we have a different consciousness, then it really does not change. I wrote a book which was actually named the best self-help book of the year. It's called The Power of Partnership. But it really goes from how we relate to ourselves to how we relate to nature and how we relate to spirituality, because so many of our religious traditions, as has been brought out by our wonderful panelists, perpetuate, indeed claim that it's divinely ordained to have these rankings of domination, right? So my question to you is, how can you incorporate partnerism into what you are doing? Because I think that it does offer the conceptual container for not only the spiritual enlightenment movements, but also for so many of the social action movements, like Black Lives Matter, like the environmental movement, like the women's movement and the children's movement, which, thank goodness, are getting a little bit more play in the conversation, but still as a sort of a thing to itself, whereas they're all really connected.
I know that one of the things that we work with within One Spirit is the idea And this really comes out of integral spirituality, that a fully developed spiritual life is multidimensional. And the dimensions include waking up, you know, the awakening to a deeper vision of what is behind the superficial phenomena of the world. Growing up, which is moving through that developmental trajectory that I described, from me to we, to all of us, to all of life. Cleaning up, which is doing our shadow work, and particularly in the dualistic mentality that you describe is so embedded in the domination system, where we project everything we consider unacceptable out onto the world, and then feel justified in either attacking it or distancing from it. So doing the what Jesus in the Gospels described as removing the log from your own eyes, so that you can see clearly how to help your brother take the speck out of his. And showing up, which is engaging in the world in a way that is focused on being of service to the well-being of all. They've since added a couple of dimensions, linking up and lifting up. And I think that certainly what we try to do is bring anything that we find helpful in any of these dimensions to the attention of our students. So I would love to be in conversation with you about offering a class to our students and our graduates, or doing an evening where you could simply describe the Four Cornerstones. I guess my own perspective is that each of us is drawn to contribute and to act in the world in the ways that are most resonant with our own, both our own joy and our own heartbreak. And that I don't believe someone can have a mature spirituality and do nothing but sit on the meditation cushion. I think there's something lacking in that person's spirituality if that's the case. If our spirituality isn't expressed in action, both within our small sphere of influence, our personal relationships, and then in service to a larger community, that there's something missing. So for us, it's a matter of trying to make available the wonderful work that's being done out there, and then trusting that among our students and graduates and the people they encounter, they will also get the word out to more and more people.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And do get in touch with me at center. I'll give you the email, center@partnershipway.org.
I will definitely do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that we are so much part of the same impulse of humanity at this time. And what I think we offer is some grounded research on how do we really make it sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely.
And mainstream. And every one of us can change our conversation and start talking about partnerism, start talking about the real need to put love into action.
I certainly don't want to dominate the conversation, but I would like to make one additional observation. And this comes out of my own experience, again, in starting an institution, starting an organization. I have found at times that it has been more effective, rather than trying to go in and change existing structures and institutions, to develop alternatives and allow those to grow and begin to, through their success, begin to be noticed by more mainstream institutions, rather than knocking on doors that don't necessarily want to be open, but that we can actually, alongside of the mainstream, we can create what isn't mainstream, but which is effective, and that ends up having a ripple out effect as well.
Well, it certainly is true, and I don't want to keep talking, but I believe it's not really either or, but both and. And this is, for example, why we have worked so hard on our social wealth economic indicators and are now working on the social wealth index, because I think that you have to change thinking. And if you can show to people who are sort of deeply invested in, if you will, making a profit, whatever they call that, we can show them that it is not only human and environmentally profitable, but really that we need a new economics of partnerism, a caring economics of partnerism, and that is what we have to do. But I really want to hear from the others about this.
I can add a bit about the way that URI has done and continues to seek to practice partnerism in its work, because I think what you're really pointing out with the both and is that when we try to come together, when we try to live out this new story, we're not trying to base our efforts in a rejection or an antagonism of that which we don't want, but rather to come to an integrative and holistic approach that enables us to live what we do want. And so to tap into our resources, our spiritual, embodied, physical, collective resources, to live out the story that then can flourish, because simply it is what gives us life and what nourishes us. In the URI case, one of the processes through which URI has been built is that of appreciative inquiry, which many of you might be aware of, developed by David Cooper-Ryder, which is a process of dialogue that is really based upon what is working. What do we appreciate in the other? What we do recognize? What do we honor in the other? And not what we want to shut off, not what we want to dominate, not what we want to control. Through the appreciative inquiry process, URI came into being through the signing of a charter that I was talking about earlier in 2000. And that signing, that drafting of a document through which the organization came into being, took 4 whole years, with people writing each other sort of at the dawn of the internet around the world to discuss, how do we make a charter that is inclusive, that is not about what we want to take out, but what we want to come into. And the mission that developed out of that for the URI community is that we want to create cultures of peace, justice, and healing for the earth and all living beings. I'm just pointing at that particular phrasing because the earth and all living beings, with the earth as a capital E, earth, that way of phrasing who we are, so not just humans, not just our cultures, not just our religions, but the earth and all living sentient beings, that came out of a process of integrating indigenous and Eastern Buddhism and Hinduism spirituality of people that said, wait, we don't just want to have the human. We want to have the earth. We want to have all living beings. We're expanding. And so that process of dialogue that took so much presence, that took so much commitment to working through our differences, to clean up, to show up, as Riane was saying so eloquently earlier, allowed a charter that is so inclusive that now it can accommodate and it can welcome communities around the world. There's so much more work, that continues to have to be done by communities like URI and so many other interfaith and interreligious dialogue initiatives. But that movement from identity to process, from the static, this is who I am, this is how I define myself, to this is the movement that I'm part of. This is how I'm discovering myself through the collective, through the action. This is how I'm coming to know the divine, through showing up, which changes me, which transforms me, through practice, through presence. That is really, I think, where we're all having a common understanding and a common experience, and where we can really partner up even more to continue to nurture that in all of our efforts.
Perfect. I was actually going to ask you that question, Valeria. I know you, and I know your amazing ability to integrate what she speaks, she knows. And I wanted to ask you, about your work beyond URI with the environmental movement, with the Chalice initiative and climate change, with your work with Indigenous wisdom and LGBTQ wisdom. I remember when marriage equality passed, we all celebrated and said, all right, here's our leaders. Look at this success story. Let's follow that model. And I know from knowing you that you've been able to integrate so many different movements seamlessly. And I've heard Riane and Diane also talk about these are not self-interested, narrow foci. This is very integrated. And can you tell us, Valeria, how you've done that?
Absolutely. I'll just share a small example, a small story, which was when the Planetary Resilience Council, which is a cooperation circle of URI based in Vancouver, BC, of which I'm a co-convener, in 2017 hosted a bioregional gathering, which was a gathering of activists, environmental activists, Indigenous leaders, interspiritual and religious leaders in Vancouver, BC, bringing people together across the border, so from Washington and from British Columbia, to come together to talk about the bioregion of the Chalice Sea, of which we're all part. That was one example of bringing together people that usually don't talk to each other. So environmental activists are not always talking to interfaith leaders. They're not always talking to Indigenous leaders. We're not having those conversations across our professional, our identitarian, our religious spectrums. But grounding our conversation in what we share, the land, the water, the air of this region that crosses cultural and national borders, but that we all have in common, that allowed us to have a conversation that doesn't usually happen. And we chose in that moment to put Indigenous leaders at the helm, to have them define the conversation, to have them open the conversation, convene the conversation, because I recognize as a settler in North America that I am a guest, and that Indigenous people have for thousands and thousands of years been the stewards of the land, and that they hold that deeply anchored, rooted wisdom that us as white people, as settler people, can learn from and have to honor and have to vacate our power, our positions, to be able to honor that which has the voices that have been silenced. And I think Riane's points at the beginning of our conversation around children, around women, are exactly the same point. The voices that have been silenced to create our systems of domination that allow some of us to feel empowered and entitled over and above others, and therefore to really build our system through coercion and through punishment. So when we come back in this instance of the bioregional gathering, which URI has held many of in the past few years and is holding more, and Kate, you know that because you're helping to organize that, but to come back to what we share in common, the land, the water, the air, the environment, nature, come back to the basics, which is not our sort of like our economic or political principles, that are stories that we've told ourselves about the kind of society that we are, but to come back to something more basic, to then have a conversation about how do we come together around that. That is one way that I really see that a potential for that to happen. And the same my research, Kate, which you know much about, around the 2018 Parliament of the World Religions, which is one of the greatest, the biggest interfaith gatherings in the world that just happened in 2018 in Toronto for the last time. There again, Indigenous leaders were rooting this interfaith gathering in the land, in place. Where are we having this conversation? And how does the where change the what? I think that one of the weaknesses or limitations that we have in the interfaith and interreligious movement is that when we focus too much on our religious silos, so, you know, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Jew, I'm a Hindu, we forget where we are. And so the communities that we're entangled within that go beyond those identity politics, that goes beyond those static silos. So to really root ourselves in place, and therefore to listen to that wisdom of place and to the wisdom of elders, I'm glad we're doing that here in this panel as well, is one of the ways that URI and other communities can start to do that integrated work across communities and across identities.
You know, the panel that we shared together at the Parliament of World Religions was called The Here in Wow. And I feel like this panel could be called the same thing, The Here in Wow. And I get the sense that there's definitely some streams that are beginning to converge here, which naturally is what has to happen. The independent work that people and organizations are doing needs to become first collaborative, but then really cooperative, which is why this, you know, partnerism, and I love the word partnerism really because partnership doesn't describe what's emerging. There's an association with that, a definition that isn't what is happening. It's something else. So coining a new word, just like, you know, Wayne Teasdale coined the word interspirituality because interreligious really didn't define what was happening. And partnership doesn't really define, and it's, you know, it's a heightened form of cooperation, partnerism. So let's just call it that. This is a great discussion. I hate to actually, you know, stop it because it's so rich, and in some ways we're really just kind of getting into it. But it's recorded, fortunately, and I know I'm going to go back and listen to it again. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our hosts, Sabine and Jim. Thank you.
Wow. I do agree, the here in wow. I mean, this was an truly amazing and insightful and wisdom-filled panel. And like you said, Jeff, it feels that it's just the start of a conversation, and that navigator, that convener of really showcasing practical solutions as well, because there's a flourish of ideas that really are profound, but transitioning them into actions and hearing from all of you wisdom keepers that there really are practical actions that each and every individual can start to apply, and we can weave and interweave all this and really start to create that narrative that we're talking about, and also that future. And there was so much wisdom. And also I want to honor the people in our chat, because there were so many wisdom keepers there too. And it's such a profound vision of showing the united and collectiveness that we all have. And I also really resonate with what you, Jeff, said, and all others, that we need to create this ecosystem where all of these solutions and spiritual learnings and wisdom keeping insights are really highlighted on a designated platform where we can, you know, take much more out of it. And that's, of course, what Humanity Rising is a step towards. Partnerism, that new, maybe not new to everyone, but sort of going from domination to partnerism, and how to navigate that. I just sort of summarize a bit of what all you amazing wisdom keepers were saying, and Riane talking about that it's based on the foundation of childhood, gender, economics, and story. And we really need to create a new economics of partnerism. And what else? Diane talked about interspirituality, the focus on this deeper experience of unity and oneness, and what sort of happens when we really do wake up, grow up, clean up, show up. That is the new educational path that we need to start to embrace, and not only embrace, but understand. And that trust is such a core component in all of this. And I think it was Diane who said, ordinary people engaging in extraordinary experiences. And I would say that is a summary of today. Engaging in extraordinary dialogues, solutions, and experiences is really, a path paver and also a weaver of collective intelligent wisdom and unity. So I really do encourage others to, of course, view this again, but please do share as well with the people around you, because there's so much effort in these dialogues, and there's so much knowledge that, there isn't enough resonance needed to really share these thoughts and wisdoms, because it's also, that's how we can echo out all of this that is being said, not least here at Humanity Rising and all other initiatives out there. So with that, thank you so much to all of you speakers and amazing souls, and also to all of you who join us on the chat. And I do hope that you will continue to join us going forward. And with that, Jim, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sabinije. Thank you, everyone. This has been the here and wow indeed. And I thank you all. And Riane, this is the first time you've joined us. I just want to say hello, and I'm always so deeply struck by the wisdom that you carry and your passion to rework thousands of years of patriarchy into partnerism. At Humanity Rising, we've been using the term radical collaboration. And I think we're coming from different points of view, but ending up at the same place, that it's only in partnership that humanity will move into the next phase with any semblance of elegance. So I just want to thank you and Diane Burke. I've known Diane for many, many years. And I've respected what she did at One Spirit, and to see you again, Diane, it's really wonderful. We're going to have Riane back, by the way, during the week of November 3rd. November 3rd, Tuesday, November 3rd, is the U.S. election. And as you all know, it may not be a normal election. And so we're bringing together people like Riane and others, Charles Eisenstein, and others that are going to just comment on what's happening during that eventful and tumultuous week. Jeff, this is the second time Jeff has been on with us. So I just want to thank everybody. And the wonderful thing about Humanity Rising being every day, Monday through Friday, for the duration of the pandemic, is we can have people back and we can deepen the dialogue over time. So this isn't one off. So Kate, Valeria, Anne, and Diane would love to have you back. We'll certainly be having Jeff back because prosocial is the future. That's partnership. That's cooperation, whatever you call it, radical collaboration. Humanity has got to get together and honor the diversity amongst us. And that brings us to our session tomorrow. We're going to be having a session on gender and how gender, after, again, thousands of years of patriarchy, is now just exploding. And you have lesbian, you have gay, you have trans, you've got bi, you've got queer, you've got pan, you've got everything now just exploding out into the world. And I believe it's one of the most important trends in humanity today. So tomorrow we're going to dive into the whole issue of the rise of Eros in all the colors of the rainbow. and what that means for humanity, as in the midst of this pandemic, we seek to articulate a vision of the human future that can make all of us more whole, and in fact capable of the partnerism that Riane and others are so ardently calling for. So thank you, everyone. A great panel. It'll be up on our YouTube channel shortly, and we'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same station, Sabinije and I, for this next session, session 92, between 5 and 6:30 p.m. Central European time. Bye, everyone. Thank you all.